The first thing I remember is the sound of the lock clicking behind me, not loud or dramatic, just final enough to make my chest tighten before my thoughts caught up. I didn't yet understand that this would become the moment I'd keep returning to years later, the point I'd circle in conversations with myself when I tried to explain how a life can tilt without announcing itself. At the time, it felt like a misunderstanding stretched too far, a situation I would tolerate until it resolved back into something familiar. I was certain of who I was then. Certain in the way people often are when they've never had to defend their certainty to themselves. I had come home late that afternoon, irritated more than anything else. The day had been ordinary in the way that drains you, commutes, expectations, small compromises that pile up unnoticed. When she said she needed to talk, I barely looked up. When she told me to sit, I laughed, assuming it was some elaborate joke that would land eventually if I waited long enough. But humor has a way of evaporating when it isn't shared. She didn't raise her voice. That was the strange part. Everything about her was calm, methodical, almost rehearsed. The clothes laid out on the bed weren't presented as a threat or a dare. They were simply there, occupying space, refusing to be ignored. I remember focusing on the fabric because it felt safer than meeting her eyes. Cotton. Soft. Ordinary. Unremarkable, except for what it implied. I argued, of course. Not with the kind of righteous anger I'd later wish I'd had, but with defensive confusion. This was absurd. This wasn't me. This wasn't funny. This wasn't acceptable. Each sentence started with "I'm not," as though identity were a locked door that could be secured by repeating its name. She listened. She always did. Then she explained why she was asking this of me, why she said asking even though the word didn't quite fit. There was history between us, unbalanced favors, a ledger I'd never known was being kept. She framed it as temporary. An exercise. A lesson in perspective. You'll understand something by the end, she said, and you'll be able to go back. That last part mattered to me more than I realized at the time. I wish I could say I refused on principle, that I stood up for myself in a way that would make sense to the person I am now. The truth is more uncomfortable. I agreed because I was afraid of what saying no would cost me. I agreed because I believed the self I knew was too solid to be affected by clothing, by names, by a role I didn't intend to keep. I agreed because I thought this was about endurance, not change. The first time I put the clothes on, I did it quickly, like ripping off a bandage. No mirror. No ceremony. I treated it like a task to be completed so I could move on. But even without looking, I felt it immediately, not arousal, not excitement, but dissonance. The wrongness wasn't just visual, it was conceptual. My body felt annotated, as though someone had written comments in the margins of a text I thought was finished. When she told me to look, I hesitated long enough that she noticed. The reflection wasn't shocking. That surprised me. I had expected something grotesque or theatrical, a parody that would reassure me this was all a joke taken too far. Instead, I saw something quieter and far more destabilizing, a version of myself that wasn't absurd enough to dismiss. My face was still mine. My posture still betrayed habits built over decades. But the cues had shifted just enough that my brain couldn't resolve the image cleanly. That was the first crack, not in my sense of gender, not yet, but in my confidence that identity was something obvious and singular. I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with skin. The rules followed quickly. I would answer to a different name while this was happening. I would speak when spoken to, move carefully, be mindful of how I took up space. None of it was cruel in isolation. That was part of the lesson, I think. Each instruction sounded reasonable when explained. Together, they formed a kind of pressure I'd never felt before, the weight of constant self-monitoring. I told myself I was playing a part. Actors do this all the time, I reasoned. Empathy exercises exist. This was no different. But actors go home at the end of the day. They remove the costume and return to a self that has been waiting for them. That night, lying awake, I realized I didn't know when that return was supposed to happen. The next morning, she corrected me gently when I forgot the name. Not sharply. Not mockingly. Just enough to remind me that forgetting wasn't neutral. Every mistake had a cost, not imposed by her, but by the way the room seemed to close in when I faltered. I became acutely aware of my voice, my gestures, the assumptions I carried into every interaction. I began to notice how often I moved through the world without being noticed at all, and how quickly that invisibility vanished. What unsettled me most wasn't discomfort, it was recognition. Not recognition of myself as someone else, but recognition of how little attention I'd paid to the scaffolding that had always held me up. Doors opened. Conversations flowed. Authority was assumed. I had called this normal. I had called it earned. Now, every step felt provisional. I still believed this would end. That belief became a kind of anchor, something I clung to when the days blurred together and the internal commentary grew louder. I told myself I was learning something important, something I could carry back into my old life as proof of growth. I did not yet consider the possibility that growth might be directional, that some understandings don't allow you to return to where you started. There were moments, small, almost embarrassing ones, when I caught myself adjusting without thinking, responding to the name before I remembered it wasn't mine. Each time, I felt a flash of shame, as though I'd failed a test I didn't remember agreeing to take. I policed those moments aggressively, afraid that ease meant weakness. I didn't yet have language for what was happening internally. All I knew was that the effort of resistance was exhausting, and the effort of compliance felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful. Just less loud. That scared me more than anything else. The days stopped announcing themselves after that. I began measuring time by smaller markers, meals, errands, the shifting light in the apartment, because thinking in terms of weeks made the situation feel unreal, like a dare that had gone on too long and would eventually be called off by someone laughing. No one laughed. Life continued with the steady indifference it always has toward private reckonings. What changed first wasn't how I looked or how others addressed me. It was how much mental energy it took just to exist. Every movement became a decision. Where I placed my hands, how quickly I walked, whether my silence would be read as rudeness or timidity. I had never thought of myself as careless, but I realized how often I'd relied on default settings I didn't know I had. Now there were no defaults, only choices, and choices carried consequences. She insisted I leave the apartment. Not dramatically, not as a test, but because isolation, she said, would turn this into something distorted. You don't learn about the world by hiding from it, she told me, and there was no accusation in her voice. Just certainty. The first time I stepped outside, I felt like I was wearing my thoughts on my skin. Nothing overt happened. No one pointed. No one laughed. That almost made it worse. I had braced myself for hostility, because hostility would have justified my anger. Instead, I encountered glances, some curious, some dismissive, some lingering long enough to make me wonder what story they were telling themselves. I became hyper-aware of being read, interpreted, filed away into categories I didn't control. I noticed how often strangers felt entitled to comment, even indirectly. A raised eyebrow. A pause before answering a question. The subtle recalibration of tone. These weren't attacks. They were frictions, small enough that I would once have dismissed them as imagination if someone else described them to me. Experiencing them firsthand stripped away that easy skepticism. I understood how gaslighting can be accidental, how society teaches us to minimize discomfort that doesn't belong to us. At a cafe I'd frequented for years, the barista hesitated before taking my order. He smiled, then corrected himself, then smiled again in a different way, as though trying to find the version that fit best. He called out the name I was using, my temporary name, and it sounded strange in the open air, detached from the context I'd been clinging to. A few heads turned. I felt heat rush to my face, not from embarrassment exactly, but from the realization that anonymity was no longer guaranteed. I carried the cup back to my table with exaggerated care, aware that clumsiness would be interpreted as proof of something. I didn't know what, only that I didn't want to provide it. The pressure to represent, to perform acceptably, settled into me like a low-grade ache. That was when the first moral question surfaced, uninvited and persistent. What did I owe to the people who were reading me this way? Honesty, certainly, but honesty about what? I wasn't lying exactly. I was participating in a situation I hadn't initiated, but that didn't absolve me of responsibility for how I moved through it. I wasn't a neutral observer. I was part of the social fabric now, tugging at threads I hadn't known existed. I thought often about people who lived with this awareness permanently, who didn't get to frame it as an exercise or a lesson. I wondered how many times I'd been the person on the other side of that cafe counter, trying to be polite while unconsciously asserting comfort as a priority. The realization didn't make me virtuous. It made me careful in a way I'd never practiced before. At home, the dynamic shifted subtly. She corrected me less often, not because I made fewer mistakes, but because I caught them myself. That autonomy felt dangerous. I worried that taking ownership meant conceding something essential. Still, there was a strange relief in not being watched as closely, in proving, if only to myself, that I could navigate this without constant instruction. We talked more, too. Not about the arrangement directly, but about broader things, family expectations, the stories we tell ourselves to survive, the difference between intention and impact. She never framed this as a test of my character, but I began to frame it that way on my own. Each interaction became an opportunity to decide what kind of person I was when stripped of familiar armor. One evening, we argued, not explosively, but honestly. I told her I felt erased. She told me she felt that way often, in contexts where erasure was normalized rather than temporary. The conversation didn't resolve anything cleanly. It wasn't meant to. But it marked a shift from roles to reciprocity. For the first time, I didn't feel like a subject being observed. I felt like a participant in a difficult truth. I started keeping mental notes of moments that surprised me. How kindness felt different when it wasn't assumed. How criticism lingered longer when it aligned with my own doubts. How I'd begun to anticipate judgment even when none arrived, internalizing a vigilance that had no off switch. This, I realized, was one of the quiet costs people talked about, but rarely described in detail. Not fear exactly, anticipation. There were still moments of resistance, sharp and immediate. Catching my reflection unexpectedly could still jolt me with a sense of loss I didn't know how to articulate. But alongside that was something else, something I was reluctant to name, curiosity. Not about becoming someone else, but about understanding the contours of myself that had gone unexplored because there'd never been a reason to look. I wondered whether identity was less like a foundation and more like a landscape, shaped over time, responsive to pressure, capable of holding multiple paths without collapsing. That thought unsettled me. It also felt honest. I no longer counted the days until this would end. Part of me feared that doing so would make the end real, and that I wouldn't know who I was supposed to be when it arrived. There was a point, not dramatic, not clean, when I realized I was no longer waiting for this to be over. That frightened me enough that I tried, for a while, to manufacture impatience, to remind myself of the life I was supposedly paused from. I replayed memories like evidence, old jokes, old habits, the way I used to occupy rooms without thinking about it. But memory is a blunt instrument. It can remind you of what happened without restoring how it felt to live inside it. What replaced the waiting was vigilance. Not just the outward kind, watching faces, modulating tone, but an inward watchfulness that felt ethical as much as psychological. I had begun asking myself questions I'd never needed before. Was I being honest in this moment, or merely convenient? Was my discomfort teaching me something, or was I using it as an excuse to withdraw? When someone reacted awkwardly to me, was my irritation about being misunderstood, or about losing a kind of effortless authority I'd once taken for granted? I noticed how often I'd previously equated discomfort with injustice when it happened to me, and how readily I dismissed it as oversensitivity when it happened to others. That pattern became impossible to ignore once I was on the receiving end of it daily. The lesson wasn't that everyone else was cruel. It was that systems don't need cruelty to function, they need habits. Family became the next terrain I couldn't avoid forever. We planned the visit carefully, or at least she did. I told myself I was prepared, that I'd already endured enough public exposure to handle familiar faces. That confidence evaporated the moment I stepped into my parents' house and felt the old roles snap toward me like magnets that couldn't quite connect. They were polite. Painfully so. My mother asked questions that circled without landing. My father focused on logistics of food, schedules, weather, as though precision could substitute for understanding. They used the name I gave them, but it sounded fragile in their mouths, like something borrowed. I felt a strange double loyalty, to the person they thought I was, and to the person I was presenting as now. Neither felt fully real in that space. At dinner, conversation stumbled over unspoken rules. I realized how much of family life is choreography, everyone moving according to scripts learned long before anyone thought to question them. My presence disrupted that choreography not because I was defiant, but because I didn't fit cleanly into any known part. The discomfort in the room wasn't just mine. That mattered to me more than I expected. Later that night, my mother knocked on the guest room door. She sat on the edge of the bed and said she was trying to understand, which I believed. She asked whether this was a phase, a statement, a rebellion. I told her the truth, or as much of it as I could articulate, that it had started as something imposed, but that it had become something reflective, something that had changed how I saw myself and the world. I didn't ask her to approve. I asked her to listen. She cried, quietly. Not because she was losing me, she said, but because she realized how much of my inner life she'd never asked about before. That moment recalibrated my sense of accountability. I wasn't just navigating my own confusion anymore, I was shaping how others learn to respond to difference. That responsibility felt heavy, but it also felt real in a way few obligations ever had. When we left, I sat in the car and felt a grief that didn't have a clear object. I hadn't lost my family, but I had lost the illusion that love automatically implies understanding. I also lost the illusion that misunderstanding is always malicious. Most of the time, it's just inherited. Back in the apartment, I began to notice how my internal narration had shifted. I no longer described myself as enduring something. I described myself as moving through it. That linguistic change mattered. It suggested agency where I'd once insisted there was none. I wrestled with that realization, afraid that acknowledging agency would invalidate the coercion that had started this whole process. Eventually, I accepted that both could be true. I could have been pushed into a situation and still be responsible for what I did once I was there. The mirror stopped being an adversary. Not a friend, exactly, but a tool. I used it to check alignment, not just of clothing, but of intention. Was I hiding, or was I choosing? Was I performing to avoid judgment, or was I acting in ways that felt internally consistent? These questions didn't have permanent answers. They required renewal every day. I thought often about people who never get to take a step back and analyze these dynamics, who are born into scrutiny and taught to call it normal. My temporary immersion didn't grant me their experience, but it dismantled my ignorance. That felt like an ethical minimum, not an accomplishment. There were moments of unexpected ease, conversations that flowed, interactions where I felt seen without being dissected. Those moments unsettled me most of all, because they suggested a version of life that wasn't defined by resistance. I didn't know what to do with that possibility yet. I only knew I couldn't unsee it. I stopped asking when this would end. Instead, I began asking what it would mean if it didn't end the way I'd originally imagined. The idea of an ending began to feel abstract, like a story device I'd once believed in because stories were supposed to have them. In real life, nothing announced itself as a turning point. There was no morning where I woke up and realized I'd crossed a line I couldn't return from. Instead, there were accumulations, small permissions granted to myself without ceremony, small resistances that quietly dissolved when they proved too costly to maintain. I noticed it first in how I planned my days. I stopped framing activities as things I had to get through and started thinking about how I wanted to experience them. That distinction might sound trivial, but it marked a shift in authorship. When you believe you're only enduring, you measure success by survival. When you believe you're participating, you measure it by coherence, whether your actions align with your values, whether you can recognize yourself afterward without flinching. Values. That word had always felt sturdy to me, like something inherited and polished over time. Now it felt more like clay, still solid, but responsive to pressure. I was forced to confront how many of my so-called values had gone untested because they'd never been inconvenienced. Fairness was easy when it favored me. Open-mindedness was easy when it cost nothing. Integrity, I learned, isn't revealed by what you tolerate in theory but by what you're willing to sit with when your comfort is no longer the priority. There was a moment on public transportation that crystallized this. A man stood too close, not touching, not overtly threatening, just close enough that my awareness narrowed around the space between us. I shifted, subtly. He shifted too. I felt a familiar instinct rise, anger, the urge to assert, to reclaim territory. But layered over that was a different calculation. How would assertion be received now? What risks came with escalation? I chose caution, not because I believed I deserved less space, but because I understood the asymmetry of consequence. When I got off the bus, my hands were shaking. Not from fear exactly, but from the delayed recognition of how often I'd moved through the world without having to make those calculations at all. I'd once dismissed stories like this as unfortunate but rare, as things that happened to other people in other circumstances. Standing on the sidewalk, breathing through the residue of adrenaline, I realized how lazy that dismissal had been. How convenient. I told her about it that evening. She listened without interrupting, without offering solutions. When I finished, she said, "That's the part people argue about the most. Not the danger itself, but whether it counts. Whether it's enough to justify vigilance, enough to shape behavior. Whether acknowledging it means accepting limitations you never wanted." I understood then that much of the resistance around gender expression isn't about disbelief, it's about loss. The loss of simplicity, of narratives where intention is all that matters, where the world responds proportionally and fairly. Accepting structural imbalance means accepting that good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes. That's a harder lesson than people admit. My internal dialogue became more disciplined after that. I stopped allowing myself the easy out of resentment. When I felt angry, I interrogated it, not to suppress it, but to understand its source. Was I angry because something was unjust, or because something was unfamiliar? Was my frustration aimed outward, or was it grief for a version of myself that no longer felt complete? Grief showed up in unexpected ways. Sometimes it was nostalgia for things I hadn't lost, only recontextualized. Sometimes it was anger at myself for adapting too well, as though adaptation were a betrayal. I worried that my ease invalidated the seriousness of the situation, that finding moments of alignment meant I was conceding something fundamental. It took time to understand that adaptation isn't capitulation. It's intelligence applied to reality. I also began to notice how people responded when they sensed my uncertainty versus when they sensed my steadiness. The difference was stark. Uncertainty invited correction, commentary, unsolicited guidance. Steadiness didn't erase scrutiny, but it changed its tone. This taught me something uncomfortable about social power. It often responds less to truth than to confidence, regardless of how that confidence is earned. That realization forced another ethical reckoning. I could cultivate steadiness. I could learn the cues, the rhythms, the postures that minimized friction. But doing so meant benefiting from a system that rewarded conformity even as it punished deviation. Was that pragmatic navigation, or was it complicity? I didn't find a clean answer. Instead, I adopted a principle that felt workable: minimize harm, including harm to myself, without erasing others to do it. There were conversations with friends that tested this principle sharply. Some were curious in ways that felt genuine. Others were curious in ways that felt extractive, as though my experience were a resource they were entitled to mine for insight or entertainment. Learning to say no, to set boundaries without apology, was new to me. I'd always believed boundaries were something you enforced when threatened. I learned they're also something you maintain to preserve clarity. One friend asked whether I was still myself. The question landed heavier than he intended. I told him I was, but that the self he remembered had been less examined. That answer satisfied neither of us completely. It did, however, mark a departure from defensiveness. I wasn't trying to convince him. I was trying to be accurate. Accuracy became my North Star. Not certainty. Not comfort. Accuracy. What was I actually feeling? What was actually changing? What remained intact? I discovered that much of what I feared losing, my sense of humor, my analytical habits, my moral instincts, hadn't vanished at all. They'd been refracted, forced to operate under constraints that revealed their contours more clearly. I also discovered limits. There were days when exhaustion flattened everything, when the work of interpretation felt endless. On those days, I longed for the blunt relief of categories, for a world that would let me be one thing without negotiation. Acknowledging that longing didn't make me regressive. It made me human. Late one night, unable to sleep, I admitted something to myself I'd been avoiding. Even if the original conditions were reversed tomorrow, even if I were told I could return to my old presentation without consequence, I wouldn't return unchanged. The knowledge I'd gained wasn't something I could set down like a costume. It had reorganized my sense of responsibility, to others, yes, but also to myself. I wasn't becoming someone else. I was becoming accountable to parts of myself I'd never had to answer to before. That realization didn't bring relief. It brought gravity. And with it, a quiet understanding that whatever came next would require intention, not just endurance. By the time I understood that intention would be required, I also understood that intention is exhausting when it's sustained without interruption. There's a romance to self-examination in retrospect, a neatness that disappears when you're still inside the process. Living deliberately meant living without the anesthesia of habit, and some days I resented that more than I resented the circumstances that had forced it. What I hadn't anticipated was how responsibility would start to feel less like a burden and more like a lens. Once I stopped asking whether this situation was fair, a question that looped endlessly without resolution, and started asking what it demanded of me now, the days grew clearer, if not easier. Clarity didn't mean certainty. It meant fewer excuses. I began to notice how often people sought reassurance from me without realizing it. Not reassurance about gender or identity, but reassurance about themselves. Was it okay to ask this? Was it okay to be confused? Was it okay to say the wrong thing and correct it later? I recognized that impulse because I'd lived on the other side of it for years, absorbing reassurance from systems designed to provide it automatically. Now I had to decide, moment by moment, how generous I could be without erasing myself. There was a conversation with a colleague that crystallized this tension. We'd worked together for a long time, long enough that familiarity made the shift more awkward, not less. She stumbled through an apology for not knowing what to say, then paused, visibly bracing for correction. I could have softened it for her, offered comfort, told her it wasn't a big deal. Instead, I told her the truth as carefully as I could, that not knowing what to say was fine, but assuming silence was safer than curiosity often wasn't. That I'd rather answer imperfect questions than be treated like a subject too delicate to approach. She nodded, relieved and unsettled at once. I recognized that look. It was the look of someone recalibrating their sense of what decency requires. That mattered to me more than being liked. At the same time, I had to confront my own temptations toward performance. There were moments when I realized I was presenting myself in ways designed to make others comfortable, to smooth interactions at my own expense. This wasn't altruism, it was self-protection disguised as politeness. I'd done it before in other contexts, meetings, relationships, as negotiations, but it had always been optional. Now it felt structural. The ethical question sharpened: when does accommodation become self-erasure? I didn't want to replace one form of unexamined privilege with another form of unexamined compliance. Finding the line required paying attention not just to outcomes, but to aftermath. Did I feel smaller afterward? Or simply tired? The difference became instructive. There were setbacks. Days when I snapped defensively at harmless comments, when the accumulation of vigilance spilled over into bitterness. On those days, I learned the importance of repair. Apologizing without explanation. Acknowledging impact without centering my intention. These weren't skills I lacked, they were skills I'd rarely had to practice under conditions where my authority wasn't assumed. Practicing them now felt like moral training, the kind that doesn't announce its results but changes how you stand in the world. I thought often about the word forced, how it had framed the beginning of this story. It was accurate, but incomplete. Force had initiated the change, but it hadn't dictated its meaning. Meaning emerged from how I responded once resistance stopped being my primary identity. That didn't absolve the coercion. It contextualized it. Two truths can coexist without canceling each other out. There was an afternoon when I realized I'd stopped narrating myself in opposition to the role I was inhabiting. That narration had once been constant, a quiet chant of not this, not me. Its absence startled me. I waited for panic, for the sense that I'd lost something essential. Instead, I felt a sober neutrality, like standing on a shoreline after a storm and assessing what had actually shifted. What had shifted wasn't my core sense of right and wrong. It was my tolerance for dishonesty with myself. I could no longer pretend that identity was a static inheritance rather than a lived practice. I could no longer pretend that empathy was intuitive rather than trained, or that ignorance was benign simply because it was common. This didn't make me morally superior. If anything, it made me more cautious about moral certainty. I'd seen how easily conviction could be mistaken for clarity, how often people confuse familiarity with truth. I included myself in that indictment without hesitation. The question of the end returned, but differently. Not as an escape hatch, but as a decision point. If this concluded, how would I carry what I'd learned without turning it into a story I told to prove something? How would I avoid using insight as currency, trading lived complexity for social approval? I'd seen that move before, people extracting lessons from discomfort and presenting them polished, emptied of risk. I didn't want that to be my legacy. I decided, quietly, that whatever came next would have to be governed by continuity. Not a dramatic declaration, not a clean break, but a through line of accountability. I would correct myself when convenience tempted me to forget. I would notice who I deferred to and why. I would remember how much work it takes to exist thoughtfully when the world doesn't automatically accommodate you. Late one evening, she asked me whether I felt different. Not changed, different. I thought about it for a long time before answering. I told her I felt less protected by abstraction. That I understood now how often people argue about concepts to avoid reckoning with consequences. That I felt closer to the ground, closer to other people's lived realities, including my own. She nodded, not triumphantly, not sadly. Just present. That presence mattered. It reminded me that this had never been about winning an argument or proving a point. It had been about learning how to live with eyes open, even when what you see complicates your sense of self. I didn't know yet what form the ending would take. I only knew that I wouldn't measure its success by relief. I would measure it by whether I could look back without feeling that I'd wasted the discomfort by refusing to learn from it. The ending didn't arrive as permission. It arrived as a question I could no longer avoid answering. It would be easier to say that circumstances changed, that something external resolved, that the arrangement expired on a technicality and released me back into a previous life. That version would preserve a comforting symmetry, forced in, released out, lesson learned, normalcy restored. Real life is rarely that obliging. What shifted instead was my understanding of what normalcy had ever meant, and whether returning to it unchanged was either possible or ethical. I noticed the question forming in my thoughts before anyone voiced it aloud: what are you going to do now? Not what will you stop doing, not what will end, but what will you choose? The passive framing I'd relied on early, what was happening to me, no longer fit. I had agency now whether I wanted it or not. Pretending otherwise would have been another form of dishonesty, one I no longer knew how to maintain. There was a quiet reckoning that accompanied this realization. I reviewed my own behavior with a kind of careful scrutiny I'd once reserved for others. Where had I been brave, and where had I merely been compliant? Where had I spoken up, and where had I stayed silent because silence was cheaper? Accountability, I learned, isn't retrospective punishment. It's present tense alignment. The final conversations were understated. No speeches. No ultimatums. She told me she believed I'd reached the point where the experience no longer needed to be imposed to continue shaping me. That sentence landed with more weight than any threat ever could have. It acknowledged both the coercion at the beginning and the autonomy that had emerged despite it. I appreciated the honesty of that framing. It didn't pretend the past had been clean. It also didn't trap me inside it. The first day I was free to choose felt oddly disorienting. Choice, I discovered, is heavier than obligation when you've learned to take it seriously. I stood in front of the mirror, not to assess appearance, but to check intention. What would I do if no one was watching, correcting, or expecting anything specific from me? The answer surprised me not because it was dramatic, but because it was measured. I didn't rush to reclaim anything. I didn't make a point of rejecting what I'd learned. I made decisions slowly, sometimes tentatively, allowing space for uncertainty without treating it as failure. That patience felt earned. It was the opposite of avoidance. Some relationships recalibrated naturally. Others didn't survive the adjustment. I learned that growth doesn't require universal approval, and that not everyone is willing to update their understanding of you when it complicates their own identity. Letting those tensions exist without trying to resolve them immediately was another skill I hadn't known I needed. What remained most vividly was the shift in how I perceived other people. I listened differently. Not more politely, more accurately. I paid attention to who was being interrupted, whose discomfort was being minimized, whose confidence was being mistaken for competence. These weren't abstract observations. They were grounded in memory, in lived sensations I could still summon if I closed my eyes. That memory acted as a moral check, preventing me from retreating into old habits unnoticed. I also became more honest about my limits. Empathy isn't infinite, and pretending otherwise leads to burnout disguised as virtue. I learned to rest without apologizing, to disengage without contempt, to protect my own clarity so it could remain useful. This, too, was part of maturity, not the dramatic kind, but the sustainable kind. If there is a single insight that endured beyond everything else, it is this: identity is not proven by resistance alone. It is shaped by responsiveness, by how willing you are to be altered by truth, even when that alteration is inconvenient. I had once believed that being myself meant remaining unchanged. I now understood that it meant remaining accountable. I didn't emerge with a slogan, or a simplified answer I could offer when people asked what the experience meant. I emerged with a practice. A way of checking my assumptions before acting on them. A way of noticing when comfort was being prioritized over fairness. A way of remembering that most people are navigating pressures you cannot see, and that decency often begins where certainty ends. Looking back, I no longer frame the beginning as something that happened to me alone. It happened within a web of relationships, expectations, and blind spots that I'd been part of without recognizing my role. That doesn't excuse the coercion. It contextualizes the transformation. Growth rarely comes from ideal conditions. It comes from reckoning honestly with imperfect ones. I never looked back in the way I once imagined, nostalgic, relieved, eager to reclaim a simpler self. I looked back with clarity, with gratitude for what I'd learned, and with a sober respect for how easily I might have learned nothing at all. The difference between those outcomes, I now believe, is attention. If this story matters, it isn't because of what changed on the surface. It's because of what changed in how I understand responsibility, to myself, to others, to the shared space we all move through whether we acknowledge it or not. I live more carefully now. Not cautiously, but consciously. And that, more than any transformation I could describe, is the part that never ended.